Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. Autumn of 1840 marked the beginning of what would later be called the Duval Incident. In St. Francisville, West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, a sprawling cotton plantation stood as a monument to Southern prosperity. The Willows, as it was known locally, was owned by Henry Duval, a third-generation planter whose family had established themselves as fixtures of Louisiana society. The estate sat approximately 14 miles from Baton Rouge, accessible by a winding dirt road that cut through dense cypress forests. What happened within those whitewashed walls would remain buried for decades, mentioned only in hushed whispers among the oldest residents. The first peculiarity noted by the household staff was how Margaret Duval began serving her husband's morning coffee herself, dismissing the house servant who had performed this duty for over 7 years. According to Frances Miller, whose grandmother had worked in the kitchen at the Willows, this change came suddenly and without explanation. My grandmother said Mrs. Duval insisted on grinding the beans herself and would allow no one else to prepare the master's morning cup, Miller recounted in an interview recorded for the West Feliciana Historical Society in 1963. This interview was subsequently archived and largely forgotten until 1968. When a graduate student discovered it while researching antebellum household practices. What makes the Duval case particularly unsettling is not merely what happened, but how methodically ordinary it appeared to outside observers. The plantation continued to function. Social calls were made and received. Church services were attended. Yet beneath this veneer of Southern gentility, something profoundly wrong was taking place, one cup of coffee at a time. The official parish records from 1840 show no indication of anything amiss at the Willows. The plantation's productivity remained consistent, though several entries in the shipping manifests suggest a gradual decline in Henry Duval's personal oversight of business matters. A notation from October 12, 1840 reads, "Mr. Duval absent from inspection. Mrs. Duval provided necessary signatures." By December of that same year, Margaret Duval's signature appears on no fewer than 17 business documents previously handled exclusively by her husband. What happened to Henry Duval began slowly, imperceptibly, like the changing of seasons that one only notices when the transformation is already complete. According to accounts compiled decades later, the plantation owner's decline manifested first as occasional tremors in his hands, dismissed by local physician Dr. James Thornton as nothing more than the natural consequence of a man approaching his middle years. Henry Duval was 42 years old. But something about those morning coffees, served with precise regularity by Margaret's own hand, seems to have accelerated whatever affliction had taken hold of Henry Duval. By January of 1841, visitors to the Willows remarked on his pallid complexion and noticeable weight loss. The once imposing figure had begun to stoop slightly. His voice, previously described as commanding enough to carry across the entire plantation, had softened to what one guest called hardly more than a whisper. The Duval marriage had not always been marked by such quiet malevolence. County records show that Henry Duval married Margaret Beaumont in the spring of 1834. She was 20 years old, the daughter of a modestly successful merchant from New Orleans, 17 years younger than her husband. The marriage was advantageous for both families. Henry gained connections to New Orleans shipping interests, while the Beaumonts secured their daughter's position in the landed gentry. The early years of their marriage appeared outwardly harmonious, though few personal correspondences survive to provide insight into their private relationship. What we do know comes primarily from a collection of letters discovered in 1958 during renovations to the old Duval property. These letters, written by Margaret to her younger sister Elizabeth in New Orleans, reveal a gradual but profound shift in Margaret's perception of her husband. In an 1835 letter, she writes with apparent affection, "Henry continues to be most attentive to my comfort and has purchased a fine piano for the parlour, though you know I play but poorly." By 1838, her tone had changed markedly. H grows more tiresome with each passing season. His indecision regarding the western fields has cost us considerably, yet he lacks the temperament to entertain any suggestion I might offer. The letters grow increasingly bitter through 1839, with one particularly telling passage from August of that year. "I find myself married to a man who possesses neither the wisdom to make sound decisions nor the strength to enforce them. The overseer all but laughs behind his back. Yesterday at dinner, H. could not even bring himself to dismiss a house servant who had broken the Chinese teapot. Instead, he fumbled through an awkward reprimand that left the girl more confused than chastened. I felt such shame witnessing his weakness." According to local physician records uncovered in the West Feliciana Parish archives in 1954, Henry Duval began complaining of unusual symptoms in late 1840. Dr. Thornton's medical journal contains sporadic entries regarding visits to the Willows, noting persistent digestive distress, curious numbness in extremities, and episodes of confusion. On November 23, 1840, the doctor wrote, "Mr. Duval's condition continues to deteriorate. Prescribed laudanum for the pain and recommended a reduction in coffee consumption, as the beverage appears to exacerbate his trembling." Intriguingly, Margaret Duval reportedly objected to this last recommendation, insisting that her husband's morning coffee was the sole pleasure remaining to him. The winter of 1840 to 1841 was unusually cold for Louisiana, and the Duval household, like many others, turned inward during those frost-bitten months. Few visitors called at the Willows, and those who did were rarely permitted beyond the front parlour. Margaret explained this isolation as necessary for her husband's recovery from what she described as a nervous condition brought on by excessive work. According to household accounts, however, Henry Duval had ceased meaningful involvement in the plantation's operation by this time. Sarah Johnson, whose great-grandmother had been a house servant at the Willows, shared a disturbing oral history passed down through her family. In an account recorded by the Louisiana Folklore Society in 1966, Johnson stated, "My great-grandmother told her daughter, who told my mother, who told me, that Mrs. Duval kept a special tin in her dressing room. It was hidden behind a loose board, and she would take a small amount of powder from it each morning before preparing the master's coffee. Great-grandmother noticed the master's hands would shake worse after drinking it, and his mind seemed to wander more and more." This account aligns disturbingly with an inventory taken after Margaret Duval's death many years later. Among her personal effects was listed one small tin box, heavily tarnished, contents unknown. This item was apparently discarded during the estate settlement and never examined. By February of 1841, Henry Duval's condition had deteriorated significantly. Dr. Thornton's records indicate 3 visits in a single week, though the physician remained puzzled by the progression of symptoms. An entry dated February 12 reads, "Patient now confined to bed. Severe wasting evident, complaints of burning pain in extremities and clouded vision. Mrs. Duval reports he has been refusing food, taking only coffee and thin gruel. Condition defies conventional diagnosis." The most troubling account of this period comes from a letter written by Reverend William Clark, who called at the Willows in early March of 1841. This letter, addressed to his brother in Virginia and preserved in the Clark family papers, describes a deeply unsettling scene. "I was permitted a brief visit with Henry, whom I found drastically altered since our last meeting. He lay propped against pillows, his frame so diminished that the bedclothes seemed to cover little more than a skeleton. His eyes, once sharp and assessing, darted about the room as though following unseen movements. Most disturbing was his attempt to communicate, which resulted only in a series of incomprehensible whispers. Throughout my visit, Margaret remained stationed beside him, interpreting his mutterings with what struck me as dubious accuracy. When I directly addressed Henry regarding his spiritual preparations, should the Lord choose to call him home, Margaret answered that he was at peace with God and man alike. Yet something in Henry's expression as she spoke these words suggested otherwise. When she briefly left to request tea, he clutched my hand with surprising strength and formed one clear word: Margaret. The desperation in his voice haunts me still. On March 17, 1841, Henry Duval died. The cause listed in parish records was wasting illness of unknown origin. Dr. Thornton's final notation on the case reads simply, "Patient succumbed despite all interventions. Symptoms consistent with certain toxic exposures, though no evidence of such was found." Margaret Duval, at 27, became one of the wealthiest widows in West Feliciana Parish. Curiously, Henry Duval was buried with unusual haste, interred on the plantation grounds the day following his death. This departure from the customary 3-day mourning period before burial was explained by Margaret as honoring her husband's explicit wishes, though no written testament to this effect was ever produced. No autopsy was performed, which was not uncommon for the period, but nonetheless adds another layer of mystery to the circumstances surrounding his death. Margaret Duval's behavior following her husband's death struck many as peculiar. Rather than observing the customary year of deep mourning, she began receiving callers after just 3 months. By the summer of 1841, she had assumed complete control of the Willows, introducing new cultivation methods and expanding the plantation's holdings by purchasing an adjacent property. The overseer who had served under Henry Duval was dismissed and replaced with Nathan Clark, a younger man from Virginia with whom Margaret was observed to have a notably cordial relationship. The plantation thrived under Margaret's management. Production records from 1841 through 1845 show consistently increasing yields, and her business acumen became something of a quiet scandal among neighboring planters. One letter from William Bradford to his cousin in Charleston, dated October 1842, notes, "The Duval widow manages her affairs with uncomfortable competence for one of her sex. There are whispers that she had always been the keener mind, even when her husband still lived." Margaret never remarried, despite receiving numerous offers from men eager to gain control of her substantial holdings. According to local rumors recorded years later, she was often heard to remark that one husband had been quite sufficient. She maintained exclusive control over the preparation of meals in her household, a practice unusual for a woman of her station. The cook was instructed to allow her private use of the kitchen for certain special recipes she preferred to prepare herself. In 1847, a curious incident occurred that might have revealed the truth about Henry Duval's death. Nathan Clark, the overseer who had become Margaret's closest confidant, fell suddenly ill with symptoms remarkably similar to those that had afflicted Henry years earlier. Parish records indicate that Clark was quickly sent to New Orleans for treatment, accompanied by Margaret herself. He survived, but never returned to the Willows. Instead, Margaret provided him with a generous settlement that allowed him to establish his own modest property in Mississippi. No correspondence between them after this point has ever been discovered. For 10 more years, Margaret Duval ruled the Willows with an efficiency that earned her both respect and resentment. She expanded the plantation's operations to include a small textile mill and established trade connections as far north as Boston. Those who dealt with her in business matters described her as shrewd, unsentimental, and possessed of an almost unnatural focus. In social settings, she maintained the appearance of genteel widowhood while wielding considerable influence over local affairs. The discovery that would eventually lead to a partial understanding of what had happened at the Willows came in 1858, almost a year after Margaret Duval's death from pneumonia at the age of 43. The plantation passed to a distant nephew from the Beaumont side of the family, who initiated extensive renovations to the main house. During the replacement of floorboards in what had been Margaret's private sitting room, a workman discovered a small space between the floor and the ceiling below. Within this cavity was a leather-bound book, its pages filled with Margaret's precise handwriting. This journal, which covered the period from January 1840 to April 1841, was not a conventional diary, but rather a methodical record of what Margaret herself termed the progress of my experiment. The entries detailed her systematic administration of small amounts of arsenic in Henry's morning coffee, beginning with barely detectable doses and gradually increasing over months. Margaret documented her husband's symptoms with clinical detachment, noting the effectiveness of various administration methods and her techniques for avoiding detection. The most chilling aspect of the journal was not the poisoning itself, but Margaret's articulation of her motives. She wrote not of hatred or revenge, but of something more akin to scientific curiosity, combined with contempt. An entry from February 1840 reads, H. continues to disappoint in all matters, requiring resolution. Today, he allowed himself to be openly contradicted by the overseer regarding the spring planting. I observed his hands trembling as he attempted to reassert his authority. The weakness I once found merely disappointing now fills me with disgust. Perhaps it is a mercy to gradually remove such a man from a position he lacks the character to properly occupy. By July, her entries had taken on an even more disturbing tone. The transformation proceeds exactly as I had hypothesized. With each cup, H diminishes further. The tremors are now noticeable to others, though attributed to nervousness. He increasingly defers to my judgment, seeming almost grateful for the relief. I find a certain satisfaction in watching him become outwardly what he has always been internally: fragile, dependent, insubstantial. The final entries document Henry's last days with a detachment that borders on the inhuman. Margaret records his symptoms, his desperate attempts to communicate, and her own performances of wifely concern with the precision of a theatre director. The last entry, dated March 18, 1841, reads simply, "The experiment is concluded. Results as anticipated. Now the real work begins." Remarkably, this journal was not made public at the time of its discovery. The nephew, perhaps fearing the scandal would devalue his inheritance, reportedly resealed it in the wall cavity. Its existence might have remained unknown had the nephew himself not mentioned it in his will, directing that the document be recovered and preserved as evidence of the darkness that once dwelled at the Willows. This will was executed in 1953, and the journal was subsequently located and donated to the Louisiana State Archives under a restricted access provision that expired in 1968. Historians and medical experts who have since examined the journal concur that Margaret Duval's experiment constituted one of the most methodically documented cases of deliberate arsenic poisoning in 19th century America. The gradual administration of the toxin explained the progressive nature of Henry's symptoms and the difficulty in diagnosing his condition. In the 1840s, reliable tests for arsenic poisoning were not widely available or routinely performed, particularly when the victim was a wealthy white man being cared for by his seemingly devoted wife. What remains perhaps most disturbing about the Duval case is not just the calculated nature of the murder, but how successfully Margaret Duval operated afterward. For 16 years, she managed one of the most prosperous plantations in West Feliciana Parish, conducted business with merchants throughout the South and beyond, and maintained her position in local society. Not once during this period does any surviving record indicate suspicion regarding her role in her husband's death. The Willows plantation house still stands today, though it passed through many hands after the Civil War and the collapse of the plantation economy. Renovated in the 1930s, as part of a historical preservation effort, it became a museum briefly before being converted to private ownership again in the 1950s. Visitors to the area are often directed to the small family cemetery on the property, where Henry and Margaret Duval lie buried side by side, their headstones weathered but still legible. Local guides occasionally mention the story of Margaret Duval as part of the region's colourful history, though usually as a tale of female business acumen in a male-dominated era rather than one of calculated murder. Few know the full details of what the journal revealed about those morning coffee rituals and the slow transformation they wrought in Henry Duval. Even fewer visit the plantation's old kitchen, where, according to persistent local legend, the grinding of coffee beans can sometimes be heard in the pre-dawn hours, though no one is there. The most unsettling aspect of the Duval case may be how completely Margaret's crime might have remained hidden had she not felt compelled to document it herself. Her journal reveals not just the method of her murder, but a mind capable of transforming contempt into a methodical experiment in human degradation. In one particularly revealing entry from November 1840, she wrote, "The true poison was already there. His weakness, his indecision, his fundamental insufficiency as a man. I merely accelerated the process by which such weakness naturally leads to destruction. In this way, perhaps I have been merciful." The story of Margaret and Henry Duval reminds us that the most disturbing monsters are not supernatural creatures, but ordinary humans who decide that another person's life has become an inconvenience. It demonstrates how easily a series of small, deliberate actions can accumulate into an atrocity, particularly when shielded by social position and the privacy of domestic life. And perhaps most disquietingly, it shows how a murderer can live for years afterward, successful and respected, carrying no outward sign of the calculated cruelty they have enacted. The West Feliciana Historical Society maintains a small collection of items from the Willows, including several pieces of Margaret's china and a coffee service believed to have been used during the period of Henry's poisoning. These artifacts were displayed briefly in 1965, but were subsequently removed to storage after several visitors reported feeling physically ill after viewing them. The curator at that time noted that such reactions were merely the power of suggestion, though the items have not been exhibited since. In 1967, a graduate student in chemistry attempted to test the coffee service for residual arsenic traces, but the results were inconclusive due to the age of the artifacts and their handling over the years. The student's thesis advisor reportedly discouraged further investigation, suggesting that some historical questions were better left unresolved. The thesis was never completed, and the student transferred to another university the following semester. Visitors to St. Francisville today will find little official acknowledgement of the darker aspects of the Duval story. The plantation house is mentioned in tourist brochures primarily for its architectural significance, with only passing reference to its former occupants. Yet locals still speak of the Willows with a certain unease, particularly regarding the kitchen where Margaret prepared her poisoned brews. One longtime resident interviewed anonymously in 1968 stated, "There's a weight to that room that never lifted. My grandmother worked there as a girl after the war, and she would never enter the kitchen alone. She said the air felt thick, like someone was still mixing something that shouldn't be mixed." Perhaps the final word on the Duval case belongs to Dr. Eliza Thornton, great-granddaughter of the physician who attended Henry in his final illness. In a letter to the West Feliciana Historical Society in 1968, she wrote, "My great-grandfather never forgot the Duval case. In his personal papers, which remained sealed until his death, he expressed profound regret at not recognizing the signs of arsenic poisoning, though such knowledge was not common among country doctors of his era. What troubled him most, he wrote, was not just that he had failed to save Henry Duval, but that he had allowed himself to be manipulated by Margaret, whose concern he had believed genuine. The most perfect disguise, he noted, is not a false face, but a false heart presented as true. Today, the Willows stands quiet and dignified, its white columns gleaming in the Louisiana sun. From the road, it appears as nothing more than another beautiful relic of a bygone era. Those who know its history might pause to consider what secrets still linger within its walls, what whispers might be heard in the early morning hours when the household is asleep. But the memory of Margaret Duval's methodical preparation of her husband's final cups of coffee remains, like a stain that can never quite be removed. And if you visit West Feliciana Parish and happen to be offered coffee by a local resident, particularly one who lives near the old plantation grounds, some still say it might be wise to politely decline. Some traditions, after all, have a way of persisting long after those who began them have turned to dust. Some historians have suggested that the Duval case represents more than just an isolated incident of domestic murder. Dr. Rebecca Harrington, in her 1965 analysis, Invisible Crimes, Domestic Poisoning in the Antebellum South, argues that Margaret Duval's actions might be viewed as an extreme response to the powerlessness of women in 19th-century plantation society. Without condoning her methods, Harrington writes, we must acknowledge that Margaret Duval found herself in a system that offered women few legitimate paths to independence or authority. The journal reveals a mind trapped between social constraints and personal ambition, with fatal consequences. This interpretation remains controversial among historians, many of whom point to the calculated nature of the poisoning and Margaret's apparent lack of remorse as evidence that her actions transcended any socio-political context. Dr. James Whitfield, responding to Harrington's analysis in 1967, wrote, to frame Margaret Duval's methodical murder of her husband as a product of social circumstances risks obscuring the fundamental moral horror of her actions. Her journal reveals not a desperate woman seeking escape, but a coldly analytical mind that viewed her husband's life as an inconvenient obstacle. What neither historian could fully address, given the limited evidence available, was the exact nature of Margaret and Henry's relationship before the poisoning began. The surviving letters to her sister suggest growing contempt, but provide few specifics about what might have precipitated such profound antipathy. Local folklore collected in the 1950s includes suggestions that Henry may have been a harsh or even abusive husband behind closed doors, though contemporary accounts describe him as mild-mannered to the point of ineffectuality. One tantalizing clue emerged in 1964 when conservation work on a portrait of Henry Duval revealed what appeared to be an earlier painting underneath. Technical analysis indicated that the visible portrait, showing Henry as a dignified plantation owner in his prime, had been painted over a different image of the same man. In this earlier version, partially revealed by careful removal of surface layers, Henry appeared gaunt and sickly, his expression haunted. Art historians date this underlying portrait to approximately 1840, suggesting that someone, presumably Margaret, had commissioned a more flattering image to replace a painting that too accurately depicted her husband's deteriorating condition. The question of whether anyone else knew or suspected what Margaret was doing remains open. The household staff would have been in a position to observe Henry's decline, and Margaret's unusual insistence on preparing his coffee personally, yet no contemporaneous accounts suggest that suspicions were raised or reported. This silence might be attributed to the social dynamics of a slave-owning household, where questioning the mistress's actions could have resulted in severe consequences. It may also reflect the effectiveness of Margaret's performance as a concerned wife, a role she seems to have played with consummate skill. A journal entry from January 1841, just 2 months before Henry's death, reveals the extent of her deception. "Today, Mrs. Beaumont visited and remarked on my devoted care. She clasped my hand and said I was a model of wifely duty, sitting up nights with H, and preparing his meals myself when he can barely keep down servants cooking. I thanked her and said it was no more than any wife would do. She left convinced of my saintly patience. How easily they all believe the performance, perhaps because they have never imagined an alternative script." The children of Henry and Margaret Duval represent another tragic dimension of this story. Parish records confirm the birth of 2 children during their marriage: William, born in 1836, and Elizabeth, born in 1838. Both children died young, William at age 3 from what was recorded as fever, and Elizabeth at just 18 months from failure to thrive. These deaths occurred before the period covered by Margaret's journal, and she makes only passing references to the children, noting in one entry that H has never recovered from the loss of the children, particularly the boy. Another weakness. Some researchers have questioned whether these earlier deaths were truly from natural causes, given Margaret's later actions, but no evidence exists to suggest foul play. Dr. Thornton's records mention the children's illnesses as apparently consistent with common childhood diseases of the period. Still, the question lingers of how these losses might have affected the Duval marriage, and whether they played any role in Margaret's eventual contempt for her husband. The fate of the Willows after Margaret's death forms another chapter in this disturbing history. The nephew who inherited the property, James Beaumont, attempted to maintain the plantation, but his management lacked Margaret's ruthless efficiency. By 1860, financial difficulties forced him to sell portions of the land. The Civil War brought further hardship, and by 1865, the Willows had declined significantly from its former glory. In 1872, a fire destroyed much of the main house. Local newspaper accounts described the blaze as beginning mysteriously in the kitchen during pre-dawn hours, though no one was reported to be using the facilities at that time. The damaged structure was partially rebuilt, but never regained its antebellum grandeur. Some locals attributed the fire and subsequent decline to what they called the Duval curse, suggesting that the land itself had somehow been tainted by Margaret's crimes. Through subsequent decades, the Willows passed through various owners, none of whom managed to restore its former prosperity. Portions of the property were sold off, and by the early 20th century, the once vast plantation had been reduced to the main house and surrounding 20 acres. During this period, stories began to circulate locally about strange occurrences in the old house, unexplained sounds, particularly from the kitchen, and an overwhelming sense of dread that some visitors reported when entering certain rooms. One account, recorded by folklore researcher Harold Jenkins in 1932, came from Martin Williams, who had briefly worked as a caretaker at the Willows in the 1920s. "There was something not right about that kitchen. I'd lock it up at night, and come morning, things would be moved around, not big things, mind you, but small items. A cup in a different place. The coffee grinder turned around to face the wall instead of the room, and sometimes just before dawn, I'd hear what sounded like someone grinding coffee beans. Went in there more than once expecting to find someone, but the room was always empty. Cold, too, even in summer. Colder than it had any right to be." The historical preservation movement of the 1930s brought renewed interest in the Willows as a site of architectural significance. The property was purchased by the West Feliciana Historical Society in 1934, and restoration work began with the intention of opening the house as a museum. During this renovation, workers reported numerous inexplicable occurrences: tools that disappeared and reappeared in different locations, sudden temperature drops in specific rooms, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. particularly in the kitchen and what had been Margaret's private sitting room. One worker refused to continue after claiming to have seen a woman in 19th-century dress standing at the kitchen window at dawn, methodically grinding something in a small brass mortar. When approached, the figure reportedly turned and smiled before fading from view. 3 other workers left the project after experiencing what they described as sudden, intense nausea upon entering the kitchen, accompanied by a metallic taste in their mouths, symptoms notably similar to those of arsenic poisoning. Despite these setbacks, restoration was completed in 1936, and the Willows opened to the public as a museum of plantation life. Curators initially made no mention of the Duval case, focusing instead on architectural features and general historical context. Visitor experiences, however, soon added to the property's dark reputation. Museum records from 1937 through 1940 contain numerous reports of visitors feeling suddenly ill in certain areas of the house, particularly the kitchen and main dining room. Several guests claim to have smelled coffee brewing during early morning tours, though the museum did not offer refreshments and the kitchen facilities were purely for display. One visitor, a professor of chemistry from Tulane University, reported a distinctive metallic odor in the dining room that he identified as potentially arsenic-related, though subsequent testing found no trace of the poison. The most frequently reported phenomenon was a sudden sense of weakness and trembling, particularly among male visitors who lingered in the dining room. Museum staff began to notice a pattern. Men who sat in what had been Henry Duval's chair at the head of the dining table often reported feeling dizzy and experiencing tremors in their hands, sometimes to the extent that they dropped items they were holding. These symptoms typically subsided shortly after leaving the room. By 1942, the museum's reputation had become so unsettling that visitor numbers declined significantly. The onset of World War II further reduced interest and resources for maintaining the property, and in 1944, the Willows was closed to the public. The property remained under Historical Society ownership but sat largely abandoned throughout the war years. In 1950, the Willows was purchased by Richard Montgomery, a wealthy businessman from New Orleans, with an interest in historical properties. Montgomery intended to restore the house as a private residence, unaware of its troubled history or reputation. According to interviews conducted years later, Montgomery's initial experiences in the house were positive. He described the property as atmospheric but peaceful, and dismissed local stories about strange occurrences as colorful regional folklore. This changed approximately 6 months after Montgomery took up residence. In a letter to his sister dated March 18, 1951, he wrote, "I have begun to understand why this beautiful old house was available at such a reasonable price. There is something not quite right here. Nothing I can clearly identify, no ghostly apparitions or rattling chains, but a persistent sense of unwelcome. I find myself avoiding certain rooms, particularly the kitchen, without quite knowing why. And there is something about the early mornings that feels particularly oppressive. I wake often just before dawn, with an inexplicable sense of dread, accompanied by the smell of coffee brewing, though I have prepared none." By October of that year, Montgomery's correspondence indicates escalating disturbances. In another letter to his sister, he mentioned experiencing troubling physical symptoms, including tremors in his hands and a persistent metallic taste in his mouth. He consulted several physicians, none of whom could identify a specific cause for his complaints. One doctor suggested nervous exhaustion and recommended a change of environment, advice that Montgomery initially resisted. The situation came to a head in January 1952, when Montgomery woke in the pre-dawn hours to find a woman standing at the foot of his bed. In his last letter from the Willows, he described the encounter. "She was dressed as a woman of the previous century might be, though her clothing was oddly indistinct, as though seen through fog. What remains clear in my memory is her expression, a cold, assessing gaze that seemed to measure my worth and find it wanting. She held what appeared to be a small cup, which she extended toward me with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. I found myself unable to move or speak as she approached. Only the sudden chiming of the hall clock broke the moment, and when I was finally able to turn on the lamp, she had vanished. I cannot explain this experience rationally, yet I cannot dismiss it either. I know now that I cannot remain in this house. Montgomery vacated the Willows within a week of this incident and never returned, not even to collect certain personal belongings that remained in the house. The property was sold at a significant loss to another private owner, who maintained it as an occasional residence but spent limited time there. This pattern continued through several subsequent owners, none of whom occupied the house for more than a few years. Local real estate agents eventually developed a reputation for being extraordinarily forthcoming about the property's history to potential buyers, perhaps to avoid later recriminations. It was during renovations initiated by one of these later owners, Thomas Bradford, that the hidden journal was discovered in 1958. Though Bradford attempted to keep the discovery quiet, rumors spread, and the house's already troubled reputation darkened further. Bradford himself never moved into the property after the journal was found, instead leaving it largely vacant until his death in 1963. The provisions of Bradford's will, directing that the journal be recovered and preserved, brought renewed scholarly attention to the Duval case. When the document became publicly accessible in 1968, it attracted interest not only from historians, but also from criminologists and psychologists seeking insight into what would now be classified as a case of premeditated domestic homicide. Dr. Helen Martinez, writing in the Journal of Historical Criminology in 1969, described Margaret Duval's journal as a rare and disturbing glimpse into the mind of a poisoner, not acting from sudden passion or obvious external motivation, but from a cold, internal logic that transformed contempt into methodical destruction. Martinez noted the unusual aspect of self-documentation. Most criminals take pains to hide their actions. Margaret Duval created a meticulous record, suggesting either supreme confidence that the document would never be found, or perhaps a desire for her methods to be discovered and appreciated after she was beyond the reach of earthly justice. The Willows itself continued to change hands throughout the late 20th century. In 1972, exactly 100 years after the fire that damaged the original structure, another blaze broke out in the kitchen. Though quickly contained, this fire destroyed much of what remained of the original cooking facilities, including the hearth where Margaret would have prepared her poisoned brews. Investigators determined that the fire began in the wall cavity where the coffee grinder had once been stored, though no clear ignition source was identified. Today, the Willows stands as a privately owned historic home, occasionally open for tours by appointment. Current owner Caroline Matheson, who purchased the property in 2002, has taken a pragmatic approach to its unsettling history. "Every old house has stories," she told a local newspaper in 2005. "The Duvals were just one chapter in the long history of this property. I respect that history without being consumed by it." Matheson has reported few unusual occurrences during her ownership, though she acknowledges deliberately avoiding certain practices. "I don't brew coffee in the house," she admitted in the same interview. "Call it superstition if you like, but some traditions don't need to be continued." She has also maintained the practice begun by previous owners of keeping the door to the kitchen locked during the pre-dawn hours. Local interest in the Duval case experienced a resurgence in 1968 when portions of Margaret's journal were published in the Journal of Louisiana History. The publication coincided with a brief exhibition of artifacts from the Willows at the West Feliciana Historical Society, including the coffee service believed to have been used in the poisonings. Though the exhibition was scheduled to run for 3 months, it closed after just 3 weeks, following what the curator described as concerning incidents. These incidents, documented in the Society's administrative records, included multiple visitors reporting sudden illness while viewing the coffee service. Symptoms typically included dizziness, nausea, and a metallic taste in the mouth, all consistent with mild arsenic poisoning, though environmental testing found no trace of toxins in or around the display. More disturbing were reports from museum staff who claimed that the positions of items in the display case, particularly the coffee cup and small grinding mortar, would be altered between closing and opening, despite the case remaining locked and the security system showing no evidence of tampering. The most dramatic incident occurred on April 17, 1968, the anniversary of Henry Duval's death, when a male visitor collapsed while examining the coffee service. Medical examination revealed symptoms of acute distress, but no identifiable cause. The man, a professor of American history from Baton Rouge, later reported that just before his collapse, he had detected the strong aroma of freshly brewed coffee and heard a woman's voice whisper, "Just one cup. It will strengthen you." The exhibition was closed the following day, and the artifacts were returned to secure storage, where they remain to this day. The Duval case continues to fascinate scholars and the public alike, not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a disturbing example of how effectively murder can be concealed within the private sphere of domestic life. Margaret Duval's methodical poisoning of her husband, carried out cup by cup over the course of months, represents a particular kind of horror, one that unfolds slowly, intimately, between people who ostensibly share a bond of trust and care. Perhaps what makes the case most unsettling is Margaret's own articulation of her motives. Unlike many poisoners who act from obvious external motivations such as financial gain or escape from abuse, Margaret's journal reveals a murder born primarily of contempt, a cold assessment of her husband's character, and a decision that his perceived weakness justified his removal. This calculated weighing of another person's right to exist based on their meeting of certain standards represents a chilling manifestation of human capacity for cruelty. Today, visitors to St. Francisville who know the story sometimes make the drive out to the Willows, though the current owner maintains strict limitations on public access. The small family cemetery where Henry and Margaret lie, buried side by side, remains visible from the road, their final proximity an ironic testament to a marriage that ended in calculated betrayal. Local tour guides occasionally include the story in their repertoire of regional history, though they tend to focus more on the house's architectural significance than on the darkness that once unfolded within its walls. Some visitors to the area report stopping at local cafes and being struck by a momentary hesitation when offered coffee, particularly if they have just come from viewing the old plantation. This hesitation, this sudden awareness of vulnerability in the ordinary act of accepting a beverage from another's hand, may be the most enduring legacy of Margaret Duval's crime. It reminds us how thinly the veneer of civilization lies over our fundamental vulnerability to those we trust, and how easily the ordinary rituals of care can be transformed into vehicles for harm. The final documented incident associated with the Duval case occurred in 1968, when Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, the great-granddaughter of Henry's physician, visited the Willows while researching her ancestors' involvement. According to her written account, she arrived early in the morning and was walking the grounds before her scheduled tour when she noticed movement in the kitchen window. "I distinctly saw a woman in period dress standing at what would have been the preparation table," she wrote. "She was grinding something in a small mortar, her back to the window. When I moved closer for a better view, she turned and seemed to look directly at me. Her expression was not threatening, but evaluating, as though assessing whether I might be of use or interest to her. The moment lasted only seconds before she turned back to her work, but it left me with a profound sense of unease that I cannot fully articulate. Doctor, Thornton, a rational and educated woman with no prior belief in supernatural phenomena, concluded her account with a reflection that perhaps best captures the lingering disquiet of the Duval story. "I do not claim to have seen a ghost in the conventional sense. What I experienced might well have been a trick of light and shadow, combined with the power of suggestion given my awareness of the house's history. And yet, I cannot shake the sense that something of Margaret Duval remains in that place, not a spirit perhaps, but an impression left by the intensity of her methodical malice. It is as though the very walls absorbed and retained something of her essence, much as they might absorb and retain the aroma of coffee brewed day after day with patient, poisonous intent." The story of Margaret and Henry Duval serves as a reminder that true horror often resides not in supernatural manifestations, but in the calculated cruelty that humans can inflict upon one another, particularly those they have promised to love and protect. It demonstrates how the most intimate relationships can become vehicles for the most profound betrayals, and how easily such betrayals can remain hidden behind the closed doors of domestic life. Perhaps most disturbingly, it suggests that some actions leave impressions that linger long after those who performed them have passed away, not as conventional ghosts, but as patterns of energy or memory that continue to affect the physical spaces where they occurred and those who enter them. Whether one views such phenomena as literal hauntings or as psychological responses to knowledge of past events, their impact remains powerful and unsettling. For those who know the story, the Willows will always be more than just another historic plantation house. It stands as a monument to betrayal masked as care, to destruction administered drop by drop, cup by cup, day by day. And for some visitors, the aroma of coffee brewing in the early morning hours will always carry a faint note of unease, a momentary awareness of vulnerability, of trust that might be misplaced, and of harm that might come disguised as comfort. In the words of Margaret Duval herself, from the final page of her hidden journal, "The true art lies not in the killing, but in maintaining the perfect masquerade of concern while doing so. In this, I believe I have achieved something remarkable, a performance so convincing that even as he faded before my eyes, H turned to me for comfort, for reassurance, for one more cup of what was destroying him. There is a certain beauty in such perfect deception, is there not? A triumph of will and patience that few could achieve or appreciate. Perhaps someday someone will understand what I have accomplished here." Someone did indeed come to understand, though decades after Margaret had gone to her grave, and in that understanding lies the final horror of the Duval case, the recognition that such calculated malice can exist within seemingly ordinary human relationships, hidden behind the everyday rituals of domestic life, invisible until it is far too late.